to this event. I'm happy to be here in Kiev. I have not been here for several years. Of course, the situation here is a very serious one. As you all know, I don't have to go into it. I would say coming from Berlin, from the EU, my sense is that this time we are even much more closer than we were some years ago. What is going on links us in EU countries and Ukraine very strongly, and that's on the level of military support, the economic support, also the many Ukrainian refugees that are in EU countries. And we now have a formal process also, which is the accession process of Ukraine to the EU. So we have a lot of strong bonds that connect us, and of course this war situation and the candidate status put all the things we have been discussing here for many years in a new light, and if you want, at a new level. I think this war, this full-fledged invasion of Russia against Ukraine, has also been a rather momentous event for European democracies in EU member states. So I think what we need to be aware of is that this is not only a question of democracy in Ukraine, it's actually a question of democracy in all EU member states as well. And I think this brutal war has put a mirror in front of us in EU member states and the level of our democracy. Our organization is headquartered in Berlin, in Germany, and war, I think, has exposed very clearly also that we have some serious problems, that a lot of Russian money has bought itself into the German political system and created dependencies that are dangerous for our democracy. So there's a lot that we have to look into and be quite self-critical about. And of course in the EU, I think we have also been far too weak to respond to the decrease of democracy in a place like Hungary. And in this conflict we also see how it has a real security dimension, with the Hungarian government more or less siding on many aspects with the Russian government. At the same time, I see that there is a chance of renewal here, and I hope that the story of Ukraine makes clear to everybody in the EU also that the question of democracy is a very fundamental question and a question of security. So to give it a more optimistic note, I hope that the story of Ukraine can be transformational, not only in Ukraine but also in the EU, in taking democracy seriously again and to respond to the attacks of authoritarian governments and players against democracy. And which is, with this very big picture introduction, I'm happy to welcome you here. We are here, of course, to listen to our Ukrainian colleagues and to get a sense from you on where all these political reforms that we are discussing for many years, where are they headed? We are in a situation of war that's, I would say, not obviously a great moment for democratization. Many moves in an emergency go towards strengthening executive powers. It's good to note, though, in Ukraine, for example, parliament keeps working, so government never closed parliament during this crisis, which I think is really positive. And also, there may be ways now to move on certain reforms faster than it was possible before. And to explore this, we have some panels this afternoon. And the first panel, we look in particular at the question of justice reforms, constitutionalism, governance, anti-corruption efforts. And my suggestion to the panelists is that you all start with introductory remarks, maybe not too long, so that we have time also to discuss. Also, viewers here on the live channel are invited to submit questions or comments, which I could relay here to the panel and to the audience. With these introductions, I would like to, first of all, welcome the great panel that we have here. And I start to my left, Yulia Grishenko, chairwoman of the coalition board of RPR, Reanimation Package for Reforms. You have been one of the protagonists in this field for many years. We have worked together in many events, and it's great to have you here and see you here. And to the left of you, we have Halina Shisik. I hope I got that right, more or less. And you're an expert at the Anti-Corruption Action Center, and we will hear from both of you in a moment. And we have online with us Igor Kuliushku, also very well known, of course, in all these debates from the Center of Policy and Legal Reforms. And Igor, I would give you the floor, first of all, to share with us how you see the situation now. How is this reform process proceeding, if at all, during a time of war? How could it continue in a post-war period with all its other pressures that will arrive then, and maybe all that a bit in the context of the EU accession process? So, Igor, I don't see you, but I hope you are somewhere online.
Hello. I saw you on the other hand. I saw all three of you. Well, I thought I would speak after MPs as we planned. So I thought that I would have an opportunity to focus on specific examples. But it turned out I speak practically the first. So I think I can make some rather introductory remarks. Of course, today in Ukraine, we have over 90% of citizens who are convinced that we will win this war against the aggressor, against this aggression that we are facing today. But if we ask the question what people see as victory, the answers will be not as unanimous and not as obvious. However, as evidenced by the sociological research, the majority of Ukrainian citizens consider victory not only in the context of liberation of Ukraine's territories, but in a comprehensive manner. Victory is both liberation of territories from the occupation and preservation of democracy, freedom of individual in our country, and also an opportunity to carry out sovereign development in the vector that we want to develop in, that is the European integration vector, the Euro-Atlantic integration vector. So all these aspects are viewed as victory for us. Some people take it even further, but currently this is not what I'm talking about. I mentioned this so that I can point out that the issue of democracy is very important for the majority of Ukrainian citizens, and undoubtedly we think that, again, it is through the prospects, well, I mean, we see the life in the aggressor country today, the level of so-called democracy there, beyond our eastern border. So, of course, the prospect of having something similar in Ukraine was one of the biggest factors, one of the biggest drivers motivating citizens of Ukraine to resist this so strongly and to defend our independence. This is the first point. The second point is that, of course, when we consider democracy, we understand that this is quite a broad range of issues that ensure the exercise of human rights, first of all. I think this is the primary goal of democracy, not just provide the majority overcoming minority, but rather instead, when we speak at the international level, when we speak about the assessment of democracy, they look not only at the electoral processes and whether the majority do form the authorities, but rather they look at the freedom of media, the functioning of the government in the interest of citizens, citizens' participation in political life, political culture, civil rights and how they exercised. So that is quite a broad range of issues that guarantee democratic development. And only comprehensively, when there are positive answers to all these questions, can countries be considered democratic on various levels. Of course, the war carries certain risks to democracy. I can say that, well, let me make another point here. In my opinion, this is not a new opinion, of course. It is expressed in many publications for many years. Since early 2000s, we can speak about comprehensive threats to democracy in many countries worldwide. And the main reasons here, various authors have different opinions of them, but I think the key threats to democracy in developed countries are the increase in the gap between the rich and the poor. Second, its emergence of new identities and attention in these new identities. And the third is, of course, digitization, which provides very convenient tools, not just for citizens to receive services, but also to exercise various forms of control over citizens. And altogether, this gives rise to threats to democracy which can be observed worldwide. The war in which we live carries additional threats. War always engenders poverty, and this is one of the main threats to democracy, because the basis of democracy is always the middle class. When the middle class becomes poor, its weight in society drops. This is one of the main threats to democracy. But of course it will manifest itself not immediately, but rather in long-term perspective. The second point is that as a result of a war, particularly a winning war, another factor is the armed forces, which may come up with new political goals and try to obtain them through non-democratic ways. I think that today there are no such manifestations in Ukraine, or almost none of them. At least I don't feel that. As well as poverty. The poverty in our tradition has rarely been a source of political activity. Ukrainians are used to that when there is no money, they go abroad to make money rather than take the parliament by storm. We have other reasons why we would storm the parliament to organize protests, major protest of some kind. So poverty and the armed forces are probably not a big threat to democracy in Ukraine today, after the victory, I mean. And the third source of the threat is the authorities themselves. In today's conditions, the authorities are concentrated in this mono-faction group in the parliament, and this consolidation of power in the parliament plus the conditions of martial law create this impression for many representatives of authorities that they are in this favorable situation when they can use the needs of martial law in order to slightly redistribute some powers, to change the status of media in some way, and we are observing this in our lives today. Since the beginning of the full-scale aggression of Russia against Ukraine, we have been living in the situation of the so-called information marathon, I would say. One would think this is not a bad thing. This makes conveying reliable information much cheaper, and this helps unite the efforts of all media, all TV channels. It seems to be justified during the war. But after a month or two, we saw that the media, which did not require this group collegial help, but they rather were capable to function on their own, and they were some of the most patriotic and objective media channels. They faced a certain pressure by the authorities. They were deprived of certain opportunities on air, and it made it harder for them to convey information to the audience, which is a point of concern, because we see that despite society's protests, the authorities haven't fixed it yet. A second vector that gives reason for concern is that the authorities constantly try to create some parallel unconstitutional means to exercise power. They give a lot of powers to the National Defense and Security Council, giving them powers that have to be exercised by the government, and there is now another parallel structure, National Council for Recovery of Ukraine. It is hard to say why it was created. First, it seemed it was only to rapidly prepare a plan for Ukraine's recovery before the conference in Lugano, but after the conference ended, the conversations continue about the fact that the government is only part of Ukraine's recovery. So we have a suspicion whether this is not created to create some new tools of influence, to give an opportunity for the president to influence the constitutional government of Ukraine. And the third example that I can bring up, it is quite strange cases that are being opened, investigations opened into quite known volunteers, and having looked into those cases myself, I can say that there are no grounds for criminal persecution there, or rather I don't understand what they are. And these cases have a lot of attention, their number is growing, and of course this is a point of concern. And the fourth factor is the slow rate of judicial reform. We are improving the situation because this is a task of European integration, and the authorities understand that something needs to be done. However, we understand as experts that this could be done much better and faster, but this is not happening. We can also add the situation with the local self-government here. On the one hand, in the conditions of the war, local self-government in Ukraine showed quite good results. In the majority of cases, local self-government agencies were patriotic, were effective, and they were at the forefront of defense of their citizens, of their territories, particularly those that were especially affected by the war. On the other hand, the rate of decentralization in Ukraine has almost stopped today, and there are a lot of conversations that there is no decentralization that can be taken place during the war. There is a certain justification here, but we can consider laws that were prepared earlier. This is not done, unfortunately. The draft law on the extension of local democracy tools, number 7283, filed with the Parliament, has not shown any progress, and many representatives of the parliament are saying that it is not timely yet. So this is the big picture as I see it. And to sum up, I can say that in my opinion, there are no obvious real threats today, but there are certain warning signs that we already see. So we are trying to track the situation, and we need to make sure that we don't miss any serious challenges that can occur here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a really great introduction of overview, I think, of the landscape. Indeed, one can look at the deeper strata, what happens to society in this war and what does it mean for democratic culture. And then you laid out very well also the institutional side of it, and of course role of armed forces is an obvious place to look at, certain concentration of power as well. And then you mentioned specific reform areas, I think, that deserve attention. So I think this is really a great overview that sets up the discussion well. Before handing over, I just realized I forgot one thing, which was to introduce myself. I'm Michael Meyer-Sende from Democracy Reporting International. And I suggest that I pass the floor to you, Julia, to share your views on this, maybe respond already to some of the things that Igor said, and give us your assessment of the situation now.
Дякую, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for being physically in Kyiv, offline. We are grateful for your support and the support of the Democracy Reporting Institute, and we are happy to cooperate with you further and talk to you, and not only talk, but also develop democracy in Ukraine. I would like to start with the following. Our panel is on constitutionalism, on governance, and on justice. I most know about constitutionalism, and I would like to talk deeper about constitutionalism during the war and talk about what's going on. I would like to start my speech from the recent sociological data that was published by the National Democratic Institute. They did a sample the first half of August this year, and for me, for the first time, it was very valuable. We received a response from Ukrainians to the question whether they support democracy in all regions, almost the same response, and this was about 92-93% of support of democracy. This is impressive. The South, the North, the West, and the East had the same answer. People fully support democratic development of Ukraine. My answer is that almost every person realized that the full-scale war of Russia is not only against Ukraine as a sovereign state, but also against Ukraine taking a different road of development, not an authoritarian road, but a democratic road. And namely, a democratic Ukraine is a threat to Russia because it does not strengthen their authoritarianism. So people felt that this is a war against democracy, and democracy is more acceptable for a Ukrainian person because it protects their constitutional rights and freedoms. And this is a clear realization that we've seen through sociological data now. So I would like to talk further about constitutionalism and provide you with my view of the situation in Ukraine now. It's been over half a year, and we should say that the national authorities and the democratic institutions such as the parliament, they managed to work, and it is difficult for a collegial legislative body to work in the wartime, and we see that they manage almost all its constitutive functions despite the real threats that took place in the first month of the war near the capital, when the MPs, the members of the parliament, work physically. And here I would like to talk more about the constitutional functions, because it is important. If we look at that, one of the vectors of destroying Ukraine by the Russian Federation is destroying constitutional bodies at the state level, primarily the president and the parliament. They did not manage to do this. They were not successful, despite the fact that in the parliament there were some deputies who entered the parliament with the pro-Russian party, which is important. As of today, under the constitutional process in the court, it was banned. So the Ukrainian parliament managed all the challenges, and it is working, performing its function, and I will talk about some threats and challenges further. I think that it is a big input into democratic development that the parliament is working, and we not have just the president at the national level. Now, if we look at the challenges of the work of the parliament, of course, there's the security issue and the understanding that elections, direct democracy is impossible during the war under the martial law. And of course, we need to protect the members of the parliament so that we would have a working parliament. In the first month, there were many issues and questions that only the parliament could solve, because those questions needed amendments to legislations. And I would say that the parliament managed to do it. What worries me now is the line between the security of the parliament and the openness and transparency of its work for Ukrainian society. We are grateful. I see that in the third panel we will have a vice speaker. We'll be able to talk about it in bigger detail with the vice speaker of the parliament. But I will identify this as a big risk that in Ukrainian society, among the experts in the civil society, the issue is raised whether this line was identified correctly in order to ensure the parliamentary process as it should be for the Ukrainian society. On the constitutional reforms, of course, according to the constitution, and it is logical, when the majority democratic countries, maybe in all democratic countries, constitutional reforms, changes to the constitution is not possible under the martial law, and it is right. But before February 24th, when the full-scale war started, it means that Ukraine unfortunately couldn't manage. And maybe historically it is not such a pity that we did not manage to do a comprehensive constitutional reform. The decentralization reform was not completed at the level of the constitution, and also after the Revolution of Dignity of 2014, the comprehensive constitutional reform was not carried out that was supposed to manage the balance of power. There was consensus that it should remain a parliamentary presidential republic where the role of the parliament and the role of the government on development policies should be increased compared to the influence of the president on the legislative process. And a certain balance of the branches of power should have been corrected. Now we see the violation that is still present, the lack of balance that is still present. Of course, it is justified now to not go on with this process, but as soon as the war ends, we are all convinced of the victory of Ukraine at the front line, at least I am, but the constitutional challenges will immediately be raised as an issue, and I think that today already within the Ukrainian society we can already discuss issues related to constitutional process. I think that it will be obvious that the Constitution of '96 that contained a lot remains of the Soviet. There was an example of Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. Verkhovna is the higher, the lower. This is the ideology of the Soviet Union. We don't have the higher council. We have the parliament and we have the local self-government. The same, the name of the People's Deputy of Ukraine. These names, they remained quite objectively at the time. In my opinion, it was a great example of constitutionalism in Ukraine back then in '96. But today, after Ukrainian people will have this great victory with so many victims, I think that the issue may be not only of the comprehensive constitutional reform, but of the comprehensive constitutional reform with the adoption of the new version, new edition of the Constitution of Ukraine that will contain all the consolidated answers of the Ukrainian society to the question of language that is artificial. Also, the national symbol. I think that everybody also is consolidated on this now. We are all united on the trident, and also on the names, on the values. Of course, freedom, human dignity remains a value. It remains. I think that we could emphasize it more in the Constitution, and I also think that the reform of decentralization should also be completed at the level of the Constitution. As Mr. Kolyushko said, the local self-government, thanks to the previous decentralization process, has a lot of success with defending the regions of the country and with ensuring the protection of citizens, and sometimes the local self-government even sacrificed lives and threats to their families, but they protected the communities, the citizens of their cities, and obviously the central government could not have protected people as effectively everywhere, because indeed the full-scale offensive from different sides was happening from the side of the Russian Federation. And I have already mentioned that this constitutional process that in my opinion will be inevitable, and it can evidence the full establishment of Ukrainian nation as a political nation. I think that this process should be ensured accordingly to the democratic principles. It should take place very openly with the involvement of all strata of population. For instance, the military should not be dominating, despite the great support of the Ukrainian people to the armed forces of Ukraine. Or, for instance, today's political authorities should not be dominating either. Of course, they're performing well and they have a lot of trust from the Ukrainian society. But everybody should be represented equally and allowed into this process. I can't say, but I think that the main thing is that this process is very open and very consolidating, that involves as much as possible all citizens of Ukraine, where it is possible to have a national referendum. The Ukrainian people, of course, should be the one to vote for the constitution, because I now feel the lack of it. Ukrainians feeling the constitution is our value. And so that in the future we will have in our modern history, if there is a violation of the constitution at the national level, Ukrainians would give a political answer without going out to Maidan, that our constitution, our main agreement cannot be violated. So constitutionalism, I see a great window of opportunity after the victory to strengthen constitutional culture through modern constitutional process in Ukraine. What else I would like to say? There are also issues that are smaller, but they're also important. We have the issue, is it possible to implement democratic reforms during the war? A question of Euro integration. Well, when it comes to constitutional law, constitutionalism, I think that we should concentrate on fulfilling the first recommendation of the conclusion of the European Commission that speaks about the constitutional courts. It says clearly that the just selection of the constitutional judges, pre-selection, should be introduced. So it is on creating an independent and professional constitutional court. And now in the parliament we see that a little less than a month ago there was a draft law introduced to the parliament on this selection, and together with Galina and representatives of other organizations, we paid attention that the civil society would like to be included into this working group, expert group, because I'm convinced that independent constitutional court after the war should also play an important role so that Ukrainian authorities will continue acting within the framework of the Ukrainian constitution, and we need to be doing it now because we already have 2 vacancies, I would like to remind you, for judges in the Constitutional Court, and we need to fill them in regardless of whether we have the war or not, and we need to be filling them according, by the way, to our constitution. It has not been implemented here. With this preliminary selection, where the experts would identify whether the law professionals correspond to 2 criteria that are difficult to analyze for political subject, which is professionalism and high moral qualities. And further on, I think that in addition we should move further on the reform of the Constitutional Court, maybe look at more detail about the conflict of interests of the constitutional judges of the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. The previous years have shown that this issue is not regulated properly, and it should be regulated, and maybe also the issue of disciplinary responsibility of the judges. I think that we also should regulate it better. Also, the new institution of the constitutional complaint I think that it will be very important for citizens after the war. It also needs to be corrected because the analysis of the new institution of the constitutional complaint shows that it does not protect the citizens, does not provide enough protection of the constitutional rights when after the Constitutional Court they go to the Supreme Court and they do not receive the repair of damages that were inflicted by the unconstitutional actions of the authorities. And here we have another aspect that we can work with is the repair of damages to citizens of Ukraine because of unconstitutional action. Usually the parliament and the president inflict these damages. Quite rarely the government violates the constitution, but the monitoring shows that the government usually sticks to the constitution of Ukraine. And maybe I would also like to continue with Igor's idea that I don't quite understand as a constitutionalist, but we are creating the bodies that are not provided for in the constitution. So this big plan of renovation of Ukraine, for me it's quite obvious that it's one of the new programs of the government because our reality changed. We live at the time of the war. Of course, the government program needs to change entirely. And of course, the government needs to be responsible for this program. So according to the constitution, it should just have been a new government program that should have been approved by the parliament and implemented at the level of the state. I think that it is extremely important to move within the framework of the constitution because it's important for us after the victory and also now. Financial aid is very important, and we need to show the international partners that we are moving towards democracy, fully sticking to the ideology of the constitutionalism, and we provide improper control over the use of the finances that I'm convinced the democratic countries will provide for renovation of Ukraine. This will be it from me now. I hope that there are questions. I'll be happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you very much. That adds another layer, I think, to Igor's presentation, looking at the constitutional framework and some ideas here about a constitutional new start after the war, and I think that's something that would be really good to discuss. I think also it's important that you reminded the audience, you know, of the attack against the democratic institutions of Ukraine. If we discuss that in the EU, it's typically attacks on judges, for example, through legal changes and different appointment mechanisms, but you have experienced here a direct military attack, not only against your country, your territory, your culture, your language, but also against your constitutional institutions. Against clearly there was a plan to hijack or do whatever to your president, to the other highest representatives of state. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and what you said afterwards I think is also very important, that hopefully for many Ukrainian citizens democracy is the antithesis of everything you are suffering now, and that this will give a real fresh impetus to the post-war period, that it's really understood that the future of Ukraine is democracy after this vicious attack by an authoritarian government. Also very interesting for me are your elaborations on decentralization. I'm aware that this whole file was always mixed up and contaminated by the Minsk agreements, and hopefully we will not have a situation like that anymore, that Ukraine has to think of some kind of reforms in which Russian de facto occupants play a role. So this should make everything much easier and more straightforward than it has been in the past. And at the same time, I think decentralization will be super important if you think of the reintegration of liberated territories and all the complications there of refugees coming back and displaced persons coming back and people who stayed there during the occupation. So I foresee a lot of complications, and decentralization may be one answer to those. Moving from here, we go to the, I guess, to the subject of governance and corruption, given what you are working on and what your organization stands for. And that too, I think, is super important. The issue of corruption has been an issue long discussed in Ukraine. If we look at the international indices, it has not improved that much, and it has always been used also, I think, by propaganda operations against Ukraine. I see it now. There's a lot of disinformation in different European languages that weapons don't even reach Ukraine because they're sold on the black market. I've never seen the slightest evidence of that, but it of course plays with this narrative that there's corruption and therefore sending weapons is a waste, etc. So it is a liability to the question of corruption, and it will be a very important point, I think, for all the supporters and friends of Ukraine, also in the post-war period when a lot of financial support will continue to go to Ukraine. And so there will be a question how to make sure it's corruption-proof and transparent. And Alina, I invite you to give us your outlook where Ukraine stands on all this now, and where do you see it headed during a war and after?
Thank you, Michael. Доброго дня.
Hello, dear participants. Considering that among our audience we have quite a few of our Western colleagues, I will speak English if I may.
So, my first point would be the next. Since we are talking today about the threats to democracy in Ukraine, I want to stress that the biggest threat to democracy, not only in Ukraine, but in Europe and basically in the rest countries in civilized world, is Russia. Let's not forget that Russia attacked Ukraine, particularly to not let us successfully finish the judicial and anti-corruption reform we've started. In his infamous address to the people of Russia in February 2022, I know that people today are discussing a different speech of Vladimir Putin, but still, I want to remind you of his words from his speech that he gave on 21st of February, like few days before his full-scale invasion. Vladimir Putin basically explained why Russia is going to attack Ukraine, and he, among other reasons, he specifically mentioned the reform of judicial governance in Ukraine, namely the reform of the High Council of Justice and the High Qualification Commission of Judges. Vladimir Putin mentioned the selection of new director for specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office. He mentioned the reform of establishment and the reform of National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine. Well, he named all these institutions, and I'm sure that not every Ukrainian can tell you all these names, but Putin named that institutions because Russians understand that continuation of these reforms of judicial governance, reform of establishment and support of the performance of anti-corruption institutions is and successful implementation of all these reforms that we are now doing, that first of all will strengthen the democracy in Ukraine, and second of all, it would make impossible for the Kremlin to control the government of Ukraine and influence the decisions that are taken by Ukrainian authorities in the future. So Russia attacked Ukraine also to not let us to do what we are doing right now, to do the reforms. So this is my first point. And as Mr. Kolyushko has said, the circumstances, current circumstances in Ukraine, namely the martial law, can generate a willingness to usurp powers. We can't object to that. So I agree that while it is possible that those who are in power now, they might want to use their powers to maximize their influence. And I believe that the most important safeguard we have against that are independent courts. Courts of general jurisdiction, as well as the Constitutional Court of Ukraine. So our most important task right now is to ensure that Ukrainian courts are independent and Constitutional Court is independent. And I can tell you that we are working on that. In fact, we've started working on that a year ago. I wish we had started working on that 8 years ago. And for the last 8 years, we've made a lot of mistakes, and we've got a lot of lessons learned. So we got this valuable understanding, what should we do to make Ukrainian courts independent. And finally, a year ago, Ukrainian parliament adopted 2 very important laws that introduced open competitions for main positions in Ukrainian judiciary. So we've started implementing that laws, and just the day before a full-scale invasion of the territory of Ukraine by Russia, an independent panel composed of international experts interviewed the candidates for the positions in the High Council of Justice, which is the most powerful institution within Ukrainian judiciary, which decides on appointment and dismissals of judges. And the whole point of this judicial reform in Ukraine I'm talking about is to ensure that people who decide on judicial career are independent and honest, to ensure that they meet integrity criteria. So to achieve that goal, we involved international experts, because we know that this is an effective solution. It worked successfully a few years ago when we selected judges for the High Anti-Corruption Court. The same is with the High Qualification Commission of Judges. It's another judicial institution. I know that it might be tricky for our European partners because we have two different judicial councils in Ukraine. So we are, in fact, are implementing two reforms when it comes to the judiciary, and these days we are still interviewing the candidates for this main judicial institution, and we are now starting the selection of members of the second judicial council. So we are moving, I believe, in the direction of independent court, because like our first task here is to ensure that people who decide on judicial career, members of these judicial councils, are independent. And I'm convinced that the result of this reform will be very successful. In fact, in February, I visited Moldova. I was invited there to share Ukrainian experience because Moldovan authorities at that time were finalizing the legislation on judicial reform. Moldova is now following the Ukrainian model on the reform of judicial governance bodies, which is like the best proof that Ukraine is creating successful solutions that can also work for other countries who face the same problems. And well, again, Russia attacked us to not let us finish that, to not let us appoint independent members of judicial councils. So, I'm like finishing this point. I just want to assure everyone that we are working on making judiciary independent. And as a civil society, we are monitoring the process. We are communicating with the members of the panels who make decisions. We are sharing the information with them, and we are doing our job to ensure that the result of that reform will be successful. Another important task for us is to ensure that judges of the Constitutional Court are independent as well, as unfortunately we had problems in that area, and we still have, at least with regards to some judges who are working in the court right now. And as Yulia mentioned, 2 weeks ago, Ukrainian Parliament adopted in the first reading a draft law that introduces a competitive selection of judges of the court, again suggesting to involve international experts to the assessment of the candidates. At the same time, we as a civil society are calling the parliament to involve representatives, experts from civil society of Ukraine in the panel that will assess the integrity of future judges of the court. Why? Because our experience with judicial reform proved that without civil society, it's impossible to ensure the proper results, because civil society is a very important stakeholder acting in good faith and having some quite good experience in Ukrainian judiciary. So I believe that when talking about the reform of the Constitutional Court, we have to add civil society as an important part of this recipe of successful judicial reform. So not only international experts, but also civil society. And I think that the willingness of Ukrainian authority to involve civil society in the reform of Constitutional Court, in the selection of judges of the Constitutional Court, would be the best indicator of whether they are really interested in ensuring the independence of Constitutional Court, whether they are willing to have this genuine reform of the Constitutional Court. So it's our next task. And of course, I'm less optimistic when it comes to law enforcement institutions. Unfortunately, we cannot say that prosecutor's office or State Bureau of Investigation or National Police are independent. Of course, they all are doing a great job now when it comes to the war crimes, because, well, I cannot name any other country in the world who has faced with this amount of war crimes, with this scale of war crimes. So I believe that they are doing everything they can under these circumstances, but still, unfortunately, we cannot say that there are no political persecution in Ukraine. Well, one of the cases was mentioned by Mr. Koliushko. We see these unjustified attacks on volunteers. So we have to work on ensuring the independence of law enforcement institutions. And first of all, they have to be independent from political stakeholders, political players. So to sum up, I believe that for the last 8 years, we've made an impressive change when it comes to anti-corruption and judiciary. Well, I haven't been speaking about anti-corruption, but just to mention, we established independent anti-corruption institutions, and every day they keep showing their results. High Anti-Corruption Court keep taking decisions on high-profile corruption cases. NABO keeps bringing new cases, and we have positive developments. So we have a new director of specialized anti-corruption prosecutor's office. We had some troubles with the selection of the director of SAPO. This process lasted a little bit longer than expected, but at least an independent candidate was appointed, and we believe that with regards to anti-corruption institutions, we just have to keep work on saving what we've got, and to defend the independence of anti-corruption institutions, and of course finish the selection of members of judicial councils, because again, independent courts, courts of general jurisdiction and constitutional court are our main guarantee and safeguard that democracy in Ukraine will not only be preserved, but also will be strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina, for going deeper into the questions of judicial reform and anti-corruption work. What you say about the importance of judiciary for democracy, I think, is more and more understood, but maybe not enough yet. There is this organization in Sweden called VDEM. They are charting the course of democracy around the world and how countries are doing, and they have of course noted that there is a lot of regression, that many countries that were democratic become less democratic, and they identified the judiciary as the most important protection of democracy against that kind of decay, independent courts. So it confirms very much what you say. We only have to think, of course, of Trump's attempts to overthrow the American government, and the US courts that just didn't buy into it, to have a very obvious example how courts can be protective. So I think we can all agree on this question of the courts. We are a few minutes beyond 5 o'clock in Kiev. We have around another 25 minutes for discussion, and I invite anybody from the online audience to send us questions. They will be sent to me, and I'm happy to relay them to the panelists here. And as the next step, I would just like to ask you, Alina, one clarification maybe for people who don't live here and don't follow all the details, and then I will move to Igor for some responses on what the colleagues have said. And Alina, the question on detail, you mentioned there has been some intimidation or pressure on volunteers. Can you say two, three more sentences on that? What is that about, so that our international viewers understand this reference?
Yes, a week ago or something like that, it was reported that national police launched a criminal investigation against some volunteers in Lviv, the people who support and help Ukrainian army. And while I believe that it's known all over the world now that Ukrainian volunteers are very well, how to put that? They are very important, influential, and they are very strong part, essential part of the. Well, they are doing an incredible job when it comes to support of Ukrainian army, and the people who were reported by the police, as far as I remember, there are two guys. Police pretend that they somehow violated the legislation of Ukraine when they conducted the activity on supporting Ukrainian army. So the case against them is built on some like strange, well, weird evidence, and we believe that it's an attempt to attack volunteers, since like we have not seen any kind of strong evidence that would prove that they committed crimes. So we are following that case, and in any case I believe that now in Ukraine it's no longer possible just to bring someone to prison for nothing. Authorities tried this a year ago. There was a case of a famous Ukrainian activist from Odessa, Serhiy Sternenko. Mainly he is famous for his anti-Russia activities. He sabotaged the concerts of Russian artists, those who illegally attended Crimea after it was annexed by Russia in 2013. So like the guy was very famous for his pro-Ukrainian views, and there were a few criminal cases against him, and under one of the cases a year ago he was convicted by local court in Odessa. The same evening, thousands of Ukrainians came to the building of the President of Ukraine, the office of the President of Ukraine, because while for the society it was definitely I wouldn't even say not clear, like for the society it was clear that the case was faked. There were no evidence against the guy. So there were a lot of protests all over Ukraine, and then the appellate court released the guy. So I believe that the case of this activist, Serhiy Sternenko, proved that, Ukrainians are not like Russians. They will not allow just to put someone to prison so easily.
Yeah, thank you. That was very helpful. And I think, yeah, we do see that Ukrainian society is very strong, and that the resistance of Ukraine is strong also because the whole society is involved, and it's not just the state involved in that. And again, yes, that's a big difference to the Russian situation. And I would maybe play the ball back to Igor, and maybe you could comment on 2 points. One, you were a bit critical of these special efforts done through councils, which don't have a legal constitutional status, to look in particular at reconstruction efforts. That's interesting, I think, also very much for international audience, because donors, etc., work with these councils. And I understand Julia doesn't see them so negatively. What worries you? What could go wrong there? That they are not legally constituted bodies, but more de facto, ways of coordinating work. And I'd also be interested in your views on Julia's idea that after the war there should be a new constitutional moment that really involves the whole society and tries to put Ukraine on a new constitutional footing that is very solid and that is, broadly shared by society. If you could comment on these 2 questions, I'd be very interested.
Thank you for your questions. If I may, I will add to the issue that Halina has just been answering to on the volunteers. The thing is, these cases started over 2 months ago in Lviv, at the end of July, in early August, when at least it started with 2 volunteers who were brought, or criminal cases were opened against them, and the investigation was launched somewhere between July and August. And the complication there, the intrigue there, is that this entire situation was provoked by certain people who the society has reasons to think that the law enforcement agencies order this investigation, because the volunteers have been working for several months to help the armed forces. They were collecting donations and were buying cars abroad, and according to the legislation they were bringing them into the country without paying the tax as humanitarian aid, and then they were sending them to the armed forces, to the units that required the cars. And a certain person wanted several cars, not where the volunteers bought them, but in a different place, and wanted to compensate the money to buy the new cars so that they in several weeks would send them to where they were supposed to go originally. And this person was very insistent, so they agreed. So legally there is no sale here, there is no income here, because this is what they are accused of. But immediately investigative bodies got to this man and launched the investigation. We thought that there was some kind of a mistake, something was wrong, and then they will eventually solve this. But after several months after this case, when this case was quite widely publicized, a new case was launched, again in Lviv, against another group of volunteers. I don't know the details about that second situation, but I suspect that it may be very similar, because when everybody heard and saw and knew the details of the investigation of the first case, nobody would make the mistakes in bringing the cause into the country. And according to the media, there are 46 cases against volunteers that are currently open in Ukraine. And of course, this is worrying. So on the question of the constitution, I entirely agree with Yulia Kirichenko that after the war, especially after the victory of Ukraine in the war, we have an opening window of opportunities, and we also have the need for serious, large-scale constitutional reform. And because we have for a long time worked on many proposals, and we know that in our constitution there are many weak spots, and these weak spots are in the chapters on local self-governance, in administrative and territorial order, also in the chapters on central authorities, executive authorities, and also on the president and the parliament, in considering the relations between them. There are also weak points on human rights in the current constitution. So, of course, we would want already now the citizens, the civil society, and also primarily the academics, the constitutional law professionals, started the preparations and started developing the vision of the future constitutional reform. I also agree that it should end with approving the constitution either in the new edition or with the large-scale amendments with the approval through a referendum, because there will be a need to introduce changes into the chapters that are protected. This is the 1st, 3rd, and 13th chapter of the Constitution that require the changes to them to be approved through a referendum. So legally, I think it doesn't matter whether we do it as a new edition of the Constitution or we prepare large-scale comprehensive amendments to different chapters of the Constitution. But I also agree that it would be good for these changes to include the protected chapters, and this reform would be approved finally after it is approved by Verkhovna Rada. According to the chapter 13, it would be approved also through a referendum. It will increase the legitimacy of our constitution, and I think that it will become a new additional layer of the fundamentals under our state. And on the bodies that are being created, such as the National Council of Renovation of Ukraine, the problem is that these bodies are not provided for in the constitution, and their tasks, they are being created by the orders of the president and decrees of the president, and it completely duplicates what the government and the parliament should be doing. So there is no new quality. So very simply something that the government should be doing by its decisions is given into the responsibility of this newly created body. And the key role in this newly created body is by the officials from the office of the president. So there is suspicion that one of the motivations to create, for instance, this council is to strengthen the influence of the office of the president on the government and also on the activities of, at the very least, parliamentary committees, to centralize the implementation of power, execution of power. So at the very least, it is not entirely consistent with the constitution. This is why we have this concern on why this is being done. The power politically is now within one political force, within one party. You can form the government with whoever you like. You can change if you don't like this government. You can at any moment change the government, and instead of doing the politics in a legitimate way, for some reason, lately, in different spheres, they're coming up with these, just to put it softly, not very legitimate ways to implement.
On the Lviv case, I would at least note as a positive that everybody's talking about it. There's nothing hidden here, and again, that I would say is something good that the media are on these cases and can freely talk about them. Julia, I would come back to you once more on the constitutional process for once, because I have a question here on that from the audience, which is, so if you could give us a bit more detail, how do you see a broad-based process of constitutional change that involves civil society and society work? And from my side, I would ask, maybe do you see a risk also that such a process could become a delay for reforms, because then in a way we go back to basics. And we also know that transitions, sometimes they lose steam. The energy is gone, or there's some political crisis, and then you may feel, oh, we lost the important moment after a victory to say, you know, we do more pragmatic changes without going too deep, because this could, you know, be too big an undertaking. That is what maybe some people may say. So if you could say a bit more on that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your questions. How I would see it? Well, primarily based on what has been going on in modern Ukraine after the independence of '91, I would say that the main role in this constitutional process should be taken by the parliament, and we already see it starting. For instance, a year ago, before the full-scale war in the parliament, a interfaction coalition of the deputies was created that includes 300, little fewer than 300 deputies. It is already a constitutional majority, and it includes also the MPs from the majority and the oppositional MPs, and I see that the primary role should be with the parliament. And if this primary role of the parliament is present, the mono-majority and the oppositional factions, they should develop their opinion on the constitutional changes, talking with their voters. Second, I think that the broad public consultations should be organized. At the same time, the discussion should be at first not on the details, not on the detailed expert processes, but the value process is the framework when the civil society and the factions that exist in the parliament would give answers to those broader things. Then the experts, the constitutionalists, can rather easily word this. We have a rather developed constitutional law, science, and according professionals. And then, as I see it, according to Chapter 13, it is evident that, in my opinion, it is better that the MPs introduce this draft law, 300 of them, to have consolidation at the very beginning of this process in the parliament. The president can also initiate, because he is now supported by many voters, as many as possible. It also would be a positive side, I mean, on introducing this draft law into the parliament. And then, clearly, according to Chapter 13, not to repeat the mistakes on changing the constitutional model, changing the constitution, we should take the majority at the first reading, then 300 votes during the next session, next planned session, and then put this question out on the national referendum. And we should be ready to administer a national referendum by this point, because we understand that our regions, our communities have very different capacities. Those that are currently occupied, those that have been liberated from occupation, those that are destroyed, almost 80%, but Ukraine should manage to according to the international democratic standards, organize the next national election and organize a national referendum on constitution. And your second question?
Society into all this effort, and whether it could be too big of a construction site.
Well, I think that through different factions represented in the parliament, this is why the parliament should be playing a main role here. And we also have rather strong civil society, rather strong instruments that are currently in use. For instance, the public consultations and the technologies could help us here. I remembered your second bridge, whether such constitutional reform, large-scale reform, would prevent us from having some current reforms, practical reforms to renovate Ukraine? I think that definitely not. We can do it simultaneously. Even some reforms that are successful, they should have been in the constitution, such as decentralization. I don't see any ideas now that the constitution of Ukraine will significantly change the form of governance. I think that we should have the half presidentialism with the powerful role of the parliament and the government, so there will be no big rebuilding there in terms of legislation. I think that this should happen in parallel, and these parallel processes should happen in a way that I think that primarily with the constitutional reform we should amend our legislation to be according to the directives of the EU. I think that the bonus that the EU gave us is the status of a candidate member, and it obliges us to harmonize our legislation to communicate all the directives, and I think that constitutional reform will not prevent that from happening.
Thank you very much. It's already now, we're coming towards the end of the session. In the beginning you think you have endless time, and as these things go, suddenly you are at the end. We have just 5 minutes left. I have one more question, I think, which is interesting. Somebody in the audience asked, what can international partners do? They support military efforts, humanitarian, economic, but is there any more specific things you think international partners could do to support the democracy agenda? And the obvious one is, of course, EU and accession, but beyond that, are there specific points where you feel international partners come in? And I would ask you to combine this with any final statement you would like to make. And Halina, you only spoke once. No, I asked you a question, so you spoke twice. But you get 1 minute more than the others, and then we can conclude. Thank you.
Thanks for this opportunity. And well, it's a great question for me just to return to what I've said, starting giving my speech. The biggest threat to democracy in the world is Russia. So, now the Ukrainian army has already proved that Russia can be defeated, and Russia ought to be defeated. So it might seem not connected, but again, to defend democracy in Ukraine and in the world, Western world has to provide Ukraine with all the weapons we need to defeat Russia, to win the war. This is the best way to defend democracy, and I don't want to be very specific on all the stuff we've already discussed. As Yulia said, this EU candidacy plan for Ukraine is very powerful advocacy tool, especially for civil society, and this EU agreements with the EU for us in the past were the instrument we used to advocate for anti-corruption, judicial reforms, and now we have this EU accession first 7 steps, and here we're talking about the reform of the Constitutional Court. So we already have all of that, and we just need to keep cooperating with the EU, with J7, with the US on that agenda. But the most important thing we need to defend democracy is more and more weapons.
Thank you, Alina. And Igor, some final words you would like to share with the audience?
Thank you. I'll be brief. I'll say that I fully support Helena, because in order to develop and maintain democracy in Ukraine, we need to win end this war with Russia. So first, we need to do everything possible to ensure our victory. If there is no victory, there won't be any democracy. It's obvious. And in the second place, of course, I would put all of this that we discussed today in more detail according to the subjects that we discussed. But civil society has to monitor the activities of the authorities. The authorities must work in line with the constitution and other laws. The authorities must respect the standards of democracy in their activity. And of course, the European Union, which will soon decide whether to start dialogue on accession with us or not, and which will eventually make the decision whether to accept us as part of the EU or not, has to be very demanding in terms of governance standards, democracy standards, standards of independent governance, because the value of joining the European Union for Ukrainian citizens is primarily about increasing our safety and the living standard, particularly the standard of political activities that we discussed. Thank you. I fully agree with my colleagues. Weapons come first. The second thing I would say is, where do we need support apart from money and weapons? That's support of civil society, development of think tanks, and international expertise, because there is quite a lot of work when it comes to harmonizing legislation with EU directives, which requires international support as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this panel. I want to thank all three of you for very rich and precise interventions. It helped me a lot to understand where the situation is now and what is our outlook here. I'm very happy to be here with you in Kiev also. I have a slight personal reason that during the Maidan revolution I never came here, and you know, later I thought, why did I never go there? And I always felt that was wrong. I just, you know, you're in your routines and sometimes you don't think clearly, and this time it was really important for me to say I will not repeat this mistake. You know, if European democracy is fighting for survival, we all have to stand together and be there. So it was very important for me to be here and to have this event with you. And thank you very much to come to this event. Thank you very much to the audience and to the organizations. You see the logos who all were involved in organizing this event. Thank you for that too. And we make a little break, I understand, before we go to the second session. Thank you.
Good evening, colleagues. Good evening to our guests. Hello to everyone who is watching us online. I am Dri Kulakova. I am the program director of Internews Ukraine. And today we continue talking about democracy, the challenges faced by democracy in Ukraine today, how we can preserve democracy in Ukraine and how to develop it. I hope that you were here for the previous panel of this event. Today's event has been organized by leading civil society organizations and coalitions working in the sector of democracy and civil society development in Ukraine. They are Center for Policy and Legal Reform and our partner Democracy Reporting International, and we are very thankful to them for their contribution into the organization of this event. This event is also held as part of the Reanimation Package or Reforms Coalition, and it is part of the USAID program, which is funded by the United States Agency for International Development, the Next Generation RADA program, as implemented by Internews Ukraine. So today we already had quite a few interesting speakers with us, and we are now moving on to our next subject, and we are going to speak about elections, about media, about political advertising, and about political parties. I think that it will be very interesting to our guests because they work in the sector, and I'm happy to welcome our guests today. We are working in this hybrid format today. Unfortunately, we are already used to this type of events. So our guests are with us in the studio. Yaroslav Yurshishin, a Ukrainian member of the parliament, first deputy head of the Parliament Committee on Anti-Corruption Policy. He is with us today. Happy to welcome you here. And our Western partner is with us, Michael Mayer-Risenter, executive director of the Democracy Reporting International organization.
Providing here in Ukraine.
We also have our experts and politicians who have joined us online. I know that they have already joined us. We are going to see them on the screen now. They are Victoria Podgorna, Ukrainian MP, member of the Parliament Committee on Digital Transformation. Victoria, I hope you can hear us. Happy to welcome you. Irina Konstankevich, who is currently on her way to her voters, but she has been able to join us, an MP and member of the Committee on Humanitarian Information Policy. And my colleagues from the media sector, from organizations working for the sake of development of media in Ukraine, Oksana Romanyuk, executive director of the Institute of Mass Information. Oksana, I hope you can hear us, and we are going to see you now. And Igor Skladai, deputy director and leading expert on media law of the Center for Democracy and Rule of Law. So, colleagues, I think I have introduced everyone, I have introduced myself, and we can start. Friends, colleagues, today we have been talking about democracy in Ukraine. On the one hand, we have the example of an EU country, Hungary, where everyone is already saying that democracy is gradually dying down there. And this is the EU, this is Europe. On the other hand, we have Ukraine, which is currently in the state of full-scale war, which has been at war since 2014. But nobody is saying, at least none of our Western partners is saying, that there is no democracy here. We are not going to mention those who spoke this morning, and somebody who mentioned a certain neo-Nazi regime. But none of the democratic countries have any reproaches to us in terms of this. So let's discuss this. We are currently at war. On the one hand, we are consolidating society, and we are providing a complete mechanism of work of public institutions. We see that the parliament is holding its sessions. We see that laws are being adopted. We see that the government is working. On the other hand, we hear some voices that there is not enough political discussion today. There is not enough diversity. And Ukrainians are used to political discussions. They are used to dialogue. They are used to expressing their opinions. So let us talk about this. This is sort of a general framework of our discussion. Is democracy being maintained in Ukraine today? How do we develop it further? What can be the possible threats for society's consolidation? Do you need a single voice to win in this war? And this means that we all have to be united. On the other hand, we need a political discussion, especially when we speak about future elections today. So my first question to my colleagues from the parliament, and I think we'll start with Yaroslav, since you are closer to me physically. I have sort of provocative question. Can we speak about the future elections today? Does it make sense to have this discussion today? And how can we hold those elections? How do we organize them, considering the challenges that exist today? We can imagine what challenges we're going to face in the future, especially when we speak about liberated territories, and the infrastructure, the people, the mechanisms of vote, and so on. Yaroslav, the floor is yours. When should we speak about this, if not now? We are not going to speak about the time frame until the end of the martial law, of course. We cannot speak about holding elections right now. It is prohibited by martial law itself. But Andrei, thank you very much for listing those challenges that we are going to face at the upcoming elections. I would also add 5 to 6 million of Ukrainian refugees abroad, and the complete lack of capacity of the election infrastructure abroad to cover this number of voters. Even during peacetime, we always had problems with low turnout of Ukrainians abroad due to the fact that it was always challenging to reach the consulate. For example, for residents of Canada, they needed to cross almost the entire country to participate in the elections, and several times at that they would have to first check their presence on the list, then go again to vote, and few people are so committed. So on the one hand, it seems to beg the mechanisms of electronic vote, but then if we speak about digitization, the level of protection of our electronic infrastructure is not high enough yet to make sure that we can protect this process sufficiently, although perhaps it makes sense to speak about that at least. We also have the issue of prohibited political parties, which adhered to and will probably adhere to the Russian ideology, and we have no prohibition for their participants to engage in politics. Some of them have already switched camps without changing their ideological views. We have quite a few challenges which are currently discussed in this sort of safe-ish environment, non-urgent environment, where we can speak with experts, where we can speak with our Western partners. We have an opportunity to study the experience of our Western partners and to try to predict the possible problems at the upcoming elections. And we can also put forward some solutions to these challenges. I am not speaking about the system, about the open list versus closed list, etc. I'm saying that it will be highly important to conduct elections after the victory and guarantee that they are democratic. It is highly important for us to understand how to control parties, because the systems of state mechanisms of party financing are suspended, and thus, for objective reasons, because we don't have money in the budget, we have thus gotten rid of this oligarchization mechanism. And sociology currently shows that there is more attention to social media, there is more use of social media as key sources of information. But here we face the issue of fact-checking and whether Ukrainians are ready to use verified sources. Unfortunately, the war and the lack of official information or untimely publication of official information provoke the search of alternative sources, which aren't always verified. So there are more questions than answers here. Ukraine, as a country at martial law, is demonstrating rather good democracy. Scores, I cannot say it's perfect, of course. I'm not confident that the level of political, so to speak, discussion that we had before the war has to come back. But unfortunately, one of the main threats here is the lack of alternatives to political positions, and we can easily justify it with the need for unity or the need to control information flows or the reluctance of society to have this political vector. But freedom of press, freedom of media, especially freedom of media ahead of significant events, and elections are always significant events in the country's history, those are the challenges that we will have to work on in the future. We are currently working on a systematic law on media, preparing for the second reading. It contains a point on the electoral period. We as experts also stipulate how good this law will look before the second reading. I think there is little doubt that this law will be passed because it is one of the so-called Euro integration laws. It is one of the 7 points that were our homework when we received our official candidacy. So it's better to speak about elections now, even if we do it in the expert circles, even if this is not quite as public as we'd like. But we should analyze possible scenarios, and we should minimize possible challenges. So I would already point out the need to extend the number of polling stations abroad. We don't have the prospect of all those Ukrainians who left Ukraine coming back in the near future. And thus we have to stimulate mechanisms to help Ukrainians who are residing abroad, help them to vote, give them more opportunities to vote. And that gives us a question of how many Ukrainians are abroad. Are they 40 million who are Ukrainian citizens or 60 million who identify as Ukrainians and live all across the world? Like any crisis, a war is something that requires solutions of many parties. But we are using the war to raise quite difficult topics which we weren't discussing before. And the issue of improving the procedure of elections, not only the structure of elections, is possibly one of the guarantees of Ukraine's irrevocable democratic way in the near future. Thank you, Yaroslav. You raised quite a few issues. We are going to speak in more detail about the media a bit later. We have just spoken about procedures, mechanisms, tools. I hope Victoria Podhorna is with us. She is here. She's an MP and member of the Parliament Committee on Digital Transformation. So, Victoria, if you are with us, I would like to ask you something that is widely discussed today. The digital mechanism of elections. Is it realistic? Should we speak about this? How possible are manipulations if this mechanism is used? Or should we rather rely on traditional methods and thus set up all those mechanisms that we have just discussed abroad in the liberated territories and so on? Victoria, you're welcome. Hello everyone, thank you for your invitation. We have had this discussion about electronic elections for quite a while. Not necessarily online. Electronic voting is not only online. We have spoken about machine voting quite a bit because there are quite a few countries which use this type of voting. Why? Online voting is not very common. Apart from Estonia, I cannot name any country which uses online technologies that way to provide voting for people. But we have a high demand which existed even before the war, and it has now become even more acute. A lot of people live abroad now, and they remain citizens of Ukraine, and they do want to participate at least in the national elections. So they are asking to introduce this online voting. As far as I know, before the war, the Ministry of Digital Transformation held this serious research about whether they could provide the system which would be different from what they have in Russia, of course. Russia has a negative experience. And as far as I know, Microsoft studied this technology. They piloted it. Of course, it wasn't about specific voting at national elections, but they used it for things like public councils, and it was quite safe. We spoke about this actually even 2 years ago with our Central Electoral Commission, because unless we pilot solutions, we cannot introduce any digital decisions. Unfortunately, today we cannot say that it would be easy to hold this vote, even in part of the territories, such as liberated territories or abroad, unless we hold this piloting. I was thinking, actually, that if it is possible, we should use machine voting in the deoccupied territories. And this also requires piloting, but this is more realistic than online voting, especially since I think that unless Russia stops existing, and it probably won't, so if it keeps existing, the threats to digital security will remain quite high. So I think that this is the technology of the future, and most experts on IT technologies in the US, of course, are saying that in the next 5 to 10 years we cannot fully transition to online voting, even at the local level. That was the verdict they announced in 2020, most recently. Unfortunately, electronic elections are too dangerous today. So that is the situation that we are facing. Thank you, Victoria. We will have another question to you. We have just spoken about digital technologies. You can see us on digital platforms. These platforms not just show us, they give you an opportunity to ask us questions. So everyone who is watching us now can send their questions in the comments. I hope that we will have time to answer them and to consolidate them into certain groups, and our speakers will answer those questions. We have spoken more about mechanisms. Now let's speak about the system. I hope that we have with us Irina Konstankevich from the Committee on Humanitarian Information Policy. Irina, I would like to ask you, I think I have two questions right away. First, how much can we introduce the electoral reform at the next elections and implement it, if we can speak about it at all? And the second question is, we are going to have, hopefully, a draft law on the intra-party democracy, which must introduce new standards for intra-party development. How timely is this draft law, and how likely is it to be adopted when it is voted? Irina?
Andriy, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today. Personally, for me, this discussion is very interesting in the context of how in the nearest time we will be looking at the draft law on media that is already being prepared for second reading. The deadline for amendments has passed this week, and I think that very soon we will start working on this draft law. So I'm here to talk and to hear the opinion of the experts on the media in post-war period, media in the election context, media that corresponds to European and world standards, media as a democratic instrument. So these questions, I think they directly correlate with the subjects of today's discussion. On what you've been asking, Andriy, I think that probably indeed we should be working on these draft laws, because actually we have the time to prepare good quality elections, and good quality elections directly depend on the quality of party building, and parties that have quality members, I apologize for this probably not very politically correct way to say it, but if these notions are put into the laws, if it is the subject of public discussion, if we aim for this to become normal for public life, I think that after the war, when the martial law ends, these issues, we will prepare the basis to implement this into our practice, our election practice. But if we're realistic, I think that in fact the questions, not as much on the procedures and mechanisms, but on the quality of the elections, I see that we have many issues with that. Thank you, Irina. Please remain with us. I have another question to Yaroslav. Election reform. We omitted this a little bit at the beginning, but civil society has approached these changes a lot. Sometimes it was the driver that pushed the political elites. Will there be opportunity to implement this, or, as it is often said in Ukraine, it is not timely? I'm not critical about this. There are indeed some things that need to be done timely. We need to look for a moment, and in the political sphere, it's even more so. So what is your opinion on that? Well, objectively, to have a fully open, proportionate system of elections with the territories that in different time and for different period were occupied and require systematic rebuilding without final guarantees of security. I mean, we can expect Russian Federation to collapse, but unfortunately, as its imperial history shows, it doesn't happen very easily. So I think the most threatening element is, in fact, the voting on the party lists in the regions. So the opportunity to fully implement what has been achieved. I think that the most likely option is to come back for the time being to the closed party system. Of course, this will be a huge step back on the internal party democracy, but in terms of implementation and carrying out, this is a much simpler system to use under the circumstances. I will not be revealing any secret now, but any authorities will be interested in relaunching as fast as possible all levels of power, the national, the presidential, so most likely they will offer a step back to the closed party system. We had experience of such elections. Of course, the role of the party leader increases here, but if we balance this approach by bigger demands, huger demands to inside party democracy, we can have a result that will not be so bad. But we can talk about it only when the representatives, first of all, of the authorities. Well, we now have a working group on improving the electoral code in Verkhovna Rada. Unfortunately, I can't say that it is very active. The question seems to be not the timely question now, but there will be changes that will be offered. And in my opinion, it would be the most correct, as it happened often in the history of Reanimation package of reforms, the demands of the society on the red lines that cannot be crossed, even in the ad hoc situation after the war. What can be discussed and what definitely needs to be implemented in order for the election to happen, and most importantly, to happen in a democratic way. The positive things that we can mention is that going back to the most corrupt component, the majority system component, is not possible because of objective and subjective reasons. Objective reasons, again, the big part of the occupied territories that we have. Subjective reasons is the society definitely will not take it, no matter how we present it to the society. So we will not have the complete step back from the big election reform, but certain elements are now under a threat, so we need suggestions from the experts how to preserve them, to protect them for the transitional period. Thank you very much. You have a rather optimistic forecast. We're moving forward despite everything, the progress we can observe, and we can observe it in how Ukraine, despite the threats, the challenges of the first days and weeks of the war, preserved full characteristics of its statehood. We saw that all the key authority bodies work, central bodies, and most of the regional authorities as well. And I think that this is important both for the Western partners. It is also important for the state in general and for the society that possibly does not know the details of the political and state machine, but they see that there is a state, and it gives, let's say, inspiration to people. It lets them know that they're not left by the authorities, that there is an institution that takes care of all the processes, whether they do it better or worse, but they work. So I would also like to ask Victoria and Irina, as representatives of the parliament. At the beginning, we saw that most of the laws were passed by the absolute majority, and it was not very transparent. It's very understandable. It can be explained. We are not very offended by that, but further and further on, we saw that political discussion came back. MPs started saying that we are starting to have some lively battles on certain points in the laws. How satisfied are you with this process? Because the parliament is a place where people talk, where different perspectives meet in order to make the best decisions. So for you as MPs, how effective is this process under the circumstances? And in your opinion, does the parliament do well on its duties now? Victoria, the floor is yours. In my opinion, I was never satisfied with the legislative process even before the war. I think that it doesn't entirely correspond to the international standards of legislative process. And with us going back to what we had, it doesn't mean that it should be going on this way. I'm very happy that in the parliament there is a working group that works on parliamentary reform. I'm head of one of the subgroups that works on the ethical code and the law on status of people's deputy, but there are also different groups who are working on how we build the agenda and how we carry out the legislative procedure to make it according to the international recommendations. The process that was started in 2019, if it is passed, I think that it is in the nearest plans. I think it will be very good for the Ukrainian parliament to improve the legislative process in terms of its effectiveness. I think that, of course, it's very good that there is parliamentary discussion right now. We went back to the pre-war times when there was normal discussion, but it is not enough to say that the legislative process is corresponding to what we expect from it as in a country that has candidacy for EU memberships. If we want to be EU members, we need all of our procedures to correspond what's going on in the European Parliament or in the parliaments of European countries. It is more systematic work on the draft laws. It is clear cooperation on creating legislation and forming policies, first of all, because unfortunately I think that the big negative side, and not only me who thinks that, is that our parliament creates norms, but we have very weak development of policies, of systematic approaches that are further unraveled in the laws. If we want to develop parliamentarism, if we want to do parliamentary reform, we need to emphasize that, because the quality of democracy depends on this. We cannot develop policies without the parliament in democratic countries. Thank you very much, Victoria. Within the next generation of the USAID program, we have this event. It's one of the main goals of this program, to support parliamentarism in Ukraine and to improve the legislative process, the process of development of policies. Irina, how satisfied are you with what is currently going on in the parliament? In your opinion, does it fully perform its functions under the circumstances? What is your estimation, evaluation? If we have Irina with us now. If we have Irina online. Irina is traveling now to her constituency. Maybe she will join us a little bit later. Colleagues, we talked a lot about the media. Let us finally move on to this subject. Free media is one of the instruments of democracy. We talk a lot about independent media, about our media landscape. And we talk a lot about the draft law, about new media law. It is the third wave, if I remember correctly, in the recent years. There was a lot of discussion. I personally moderated several roundtables. I participated in even more roundtables. There were many of them, and they were organized by representatives of civil society, by independent experts, by international organizations, stakeholders, our stakeholders, so representatives of the authorities, of the ministries, of the parliament. Now we approach the third wave of discussion, and we hear rather critical remarks. We have also positive remarks, but as far as I can observe, in principle, we agree that this legislation should be passed because, first of all, it is timely, and then it is our homework of 7 points, right? 7 steps, and all of these challenges, especially the challenges of informational security, they push us to have the norms, how we're going to do the coverage, how we're going to protect from informational attacks, and we see that before the rockets start flying, before the guns start firing, we have a very powerful informational attack that uses all the possible means that are now allowed to be used by technologies. I would like to now give the floor to the colleagues from the media sector, to Oksana Romaniuk and Igor Roskladai. Oksana, Igor, the question is, how do you see the current state of the draft law that is now being prepared? What, in your opinion, are the perspectives, and especially on the issue of elections? What do you think as the experts? What would you correct there? What would you emphasize? What is it that we need not to lose in the further iterations, and what needs to be voted on? Obligatory. Maybe we have a little bit more time to talk about media landscape in general. It is changing now, but let us talk about the legislation first. Oksana, the floor is yours. Thank you, Andriy. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. This year brought us a lot of new things, and this draft law is also part of these changes, extreme changes that will influence the situation in the media sphere. It introduces the innovation that we have been waiting for a long time, that online media will finally be considered real media. It is necessary. We have been waiting for it for a long time. In general, there is the need to update media legislation and adapt it to the audiovisual directive. Regarding the questions that we have, it is related to the question, Andriy, that you asked. What is it important for us to preserve? It's important for us to preserve independent media. It's important for us to maintain pluralism and democracy. This is what makes us different from Russia. It is important for us to preserve discussion. In order to do that, we need an independent regulator, media regulator. And of course, in the circumstances of the martial law, we cannot introduce changes to the constitution. But we need, at least in the draft law on media, to provide some kind of additional mechanisms, such as, I know that the colleagues are already making changes into that draft law, to have the members of the National Council that are appointed by the President, to have them appointed after they're recommended by an independent commission. But in general, we need to change the system at the level of the Constitution of appointment of the members of the National Council. And I hope that after our victory, after the war, we go back to that and it will be done. What scares me the most, to be honest, is that now independent media are in crisis, in difficult financial, economic crisis, and the chance to survive is mostly with the oligarch media. I'm afraid that we may remain in the situation of mostly of media owned by oligarchs and controlled by the state. I think that would be the worst possible development of events. So the legislators, the deputies also need to remember that we need to preserve, to support in all possible ways the independent media, pluralism, and so on. And when adopting any legislation, we need to remember that it is also their safety pillow. We wouldn't like to have oligarchs ruling the political process and controlling democracy in our country. And another thing that probably is looming like a wave, social networks and their influence on the media sector. And it is something that, in fact, we can't control or regulate in any way now. I know that in the draft law on media it is provided for a certain mechanism, but let us imagine the situation of elections. During elections, we need to act as quick as possible. So something is happening on social networks, and we submit to Ukrainian state bodies, the court decides to ask Google to block some kind of application on Play Market that spreads some anti-Ukrainian fake news in order to influence our election processes. This is almost impossible to do, and to be honest, I don't even see technically how to do this. We need to start all of these corporations. They need to open their legal offices here in Ukraine, so they would take into account Ukrainian legislation. They would base on Ukrainian legislation. This is a question of our informational security, first of all. And of course, the corporations need to have regional offices and accept the national legislation of the countries where they work. This is very global, but I'm very concerned. What's happening in anonymous telegrams, that the citizens spend time there, that there is a huge amount of fake news there, and it is some sort of media, in this case, media is an anchor for us in this way. In your opinion, can new legislation improve this situation?
I don't think it can, and I think Igor will agree with me. Because now this is technically impossible to do, I guess. This is a question with many components. The new legislation definitely provides a foundation to respond to Russian disinformation better. But still, the issue of regulating these anonymous Telegram channels, a Telegram channel with, or the network itself with the headquarters somewhere in Dubai, I don't really know how to answer this question, to be honest. Just to sum up briefly, I want to say that we have to support independent media. It's very important, and I want to urge MPs and colleagues to support public broadcasting, because this is an independent network which is a guarantor of our democracy. Thank you, Oksana. Igor Skladai from the Center for Democracy and Rule of Law is with us. And the question is the same. How much can this new legislation resolve the challenges that we are facing, particularly the democratic basis? How much can this new legislation protect us against information attacks by Russia in this context? Hello, Andy. Hello, colleagues. Apologies that I'm not there with you. I want to follow up on what Oksana said, whether we can do something with Telegram. No, we cannot. I want to say immediately, we can't. Not because we cannot write this down, but because Telegram is not in any European jurisdictions. It is a non-transparent company with headquarters in Dubai. It used to be a Russian company before 2019. Now it's not anymore. But I will say something that is probably an unpopular opinion. But technologically, I don't see any other opportunities to do something with Telegram other than blocking the entire platform. Whether we will agree to this, it is quite an open question, because Telegram is an open source of information. It's quite a popular source of information, particularly in the territories which are occupied or which are under the risk of occupation. On the other hand, I want to say that one of the reasons that we blocked Russian resources was the opportunity of Russian special services to have access to everything, to all content on those platforms. So this is complete disrespect of privacy as one of the key problems that existed there. What does this law on media contain? What are we going to try to do? Try because we are in contact with Meta, for example, and we had a conversation about what Ukraine can do for better cooperation. And one of these recommendations from there is that we have to clearly define the subjects among our authorities which will take care of these issues. And they should know that if we speak about the freedom of speech, it is National Council, if it is the cybersecurity, it is cyber police, and so on. So they have to know the specific points of contact. We also have to include access to information. And we were able to grant our regulators the right to enter into memorandums with them, and this is probably the maximum that we can do now. I can say right away that things are moving forward. We are making progress. It has been almost 4 years since the directive on media services. It was adopted in 2018, and on Friday we published a proposal of a new document which regulates the functioning of the newly named media board. And the second issue is requirements to social media about how media organizations can operate on them. It is quite an interesting story because it is quite promising but also scary. Promising because media will be able to define themselves on the platform and show that we are a media organization and this is something unclear. On the other hand, I really disliked the community standards developed by private companies because their primary goal is to protect their own private business interests. So I would hope this can change in the future. In addition, we are waiting for a new document which would regulate political advertising. There is also a project at the EU level. And when we pass the law on media, we will immediately have to look at all those acts, including the Digital Services Act, Digital Marketing Act, and prepare amendments for 2024 or 2025. This is a continuous process because media develop very fast. And I think that we have to do as much as we can. Elections online, I don't know, if we speak about the elections, the recent elections were held, I looked at the amount spent on Facebook advertising was 5 figures, 6 figures. So Facebook has become a very serious political platform, but we all remember the story with the 2016 elections in the US and how Trump was elected. So unfortunately we cannot change the situation on Facebook, on Meta, with our internal laws, because it basically gets the cause and consequence all messed up. I think we will have to resolve these challenges during the war and after the war. Maybe I am taking on too much, but if there are rules which are not taking war into account, which should apply to journalism, to media, and these approaches are purely formal, this is not okay. So we create this major chilling effect for the entire platform. They can tell us you can avoid using the platform. Of course, that's not an option today. Of course, we will not be able to achieve everything we want. We are looking for mechanisms. One of my daily tasks that I do is writing complaints in order to draw attention to issues that exist on the platform. It is a small step, but it is necessary, I think. And later we'll be able to also work on this on an international level, because the problem is that the current standards cannot handle hate speech, cannot handle other issues that exist on the platform, and we will have to write a completely new set of rules. Thank you, Ihor. We have gone on a broader level. I'm sorry. Can I just comment on something quickly here in this context? There are new approaches today. Of course, they are quite fresh. This is approaches from 2021, 2022, because I handle digital. You probably heard the control of algorithms. When algorithms are developed, the proposals, legislative proposals that will be submitted in the near future in the US, I think, they require testing and engagement of various stakeholders before these algorithms are launched, so that they can avoid discrimination. And in terms of content, of course, we can't violate freedom of speech, but self-regulation can also become one of the requirements to social media, particularly to messengers, which are used by big audiences and which provide information on a completely anonymous basis. I think we can have this requirement, and we need to work on this as well. Thank you, Victoria. As for self-regulation in media and journalism, we spoke quite a lot about this. There are at least 2 self-regulating organizations, and the issue of self-regulation will be included in the law on media. This is a slightly different sector from what you spoke about. It's different from self-regulation of platforms and content on platforms. I think we'll make progress there as well. Colleagues, we started speaking about international experience. We started with the big picture. We spoke about Hungary and its democracy situation. We spoke quite a lot about our EU candidacy. We spoke about international standards. And we have with us Michael Mayer-Resende, who is the Executive Director of Democracy Reporting International.
Made all our discussions. And what is your opinion about how Ukraine is in line with international democracy standards, especially within the current situation, martial law, etc. We understand that maybe we are in a unique situation in the modern history, but nevertheless, what is your opinion on all these processes?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and I thought this discussion was really interesting and quite detailed on many important points. Indeed, it's quite exceptional, the state of war and a full-fledged war that, you know, reminds us of Second World War, basically. That's really something we are not used to here, and in rest of Europe, of course, we went through states of emergencies with COVID, and we learned many lessons there. Our organization published a lot of analysis, and we were quite critical about many European governments and how they managed COVID. So this question is around. In international law, it's allowed during a state of emergency or state of war to restrict certain rights. That is understood and accepted. The question is always the extent of it and whether it's proportional. Now, I don't know enough to really pass judgment on lots of details how it's handled now here in Ukraine. I can just maybe make a few points. In our conversations here, we heard that there's a sense that, for example, in the media, with this media marathon on the war reporting, some people start missing a little bit debate, and then they go to other channels like Telegram, and then they may get involved in debates that are partly fake and false. And this is something I think to keep in mind in all democracies. Democracy lives from controversy. So we have to see where do we create controversies that are actually meaningful, that are real, that are not fake, that are not based on disinformation, and that are not extremist. So I think there's an obligation for journalists and media, but also for us as opinion shapers, to find the debates that are real, that make sense, and don't allow absurdities or extreme voices to hijack any kind of debate. So looking at that point, maybe there's a moment where Ukrainian media should go back to just having more debates, and of course with the understanding that a meaningful debate makes the country stronger and not weaker, even in the situation. Then I had a comment on Yaroslav. He talked about how to organize elections after the war. Again, I think we have an interesting point here of state of emergency. Maybe the moment there's no more war, there's a feeling, okay, now everything is back to normal. But no, for a while it will not be. There will be a lot of destruction, there will be lots of refugees, there will be lots of internally displaced persons. So from, for example, the perspective of organizing elections, it will still be a situation for a while. Whether it's then still called a state of emergency or just understood that it's an interim humanitarian problem that has to be dealt with is something that lawyers have to look at. But it's important to think that the first elections after this war will be quite exceptional, and the integration of lots of people who are not living in their normal places of residence is a real challenge. It's not a new one. Many countries had that. I could just think of Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, but it's coming at a very large scale. And Yaroslav said then maybe we need a closed party system. You could also have just the whole of Ukraine being one district in national elections, so anybody votes, and votes do not have to be accounted to certain constituencies. That makes it much easier. There are ways to do it, but maybe the way to think about it is to say that's an interim solution, that it doesn't solidify systems that are actually not so good, that it's understood that's a one-off until the situation has improved. And in this context, I thought online voting also an interesting point, and in my perception, Ukraine is doing really well on the digitalization, actually much better than many EU member states, better than country where I live, Germany. Online voting has one big problem. It doesn't really guarantee secrecy of the vote, which is a big international principle. So if I sit at home at my computer, nobody knows who is standing behind me, or actually I'm casting this vote. Or if, and especially also if we think of women voting, and then maybe the husband puts pressure on them and says, I want to see how you vote. So it's not great in my view.
It's not the situation in Ukrainian families, vice versa.
I hope not. I hope not. So online voting is quite a tricky proposition, I would say. And then maybe, you discussed so much, I cannot respond on everything, but just the point on Telegram is very interesting also, this problem with platforms we cannot reach. I should just say that German government has managed to get in contact with Telegram, and they have conversations now, and basically they created a scenario where Telegram could have a huge fine in Germany, and this may be uncomfortable even to Telegram, even if they are in Dubai, but because they may have interactions in the EU and could be executed such a fine. So there are ways to get there, but it's really hard and difficult. And here again, I think Ukraine and EU being in a close exchange is super important, because all these things are the same everywhere across Europe, and we're discussing them. There will be a new EU regulatory framework around all these platforms, so it's really, really good, I think, if we discuss these things together.
Thanks, Michael. Шановні наші
Dear guests, dear viewers, dear listeners, unfortunately, our time together is basically over. I am very thankful to our guests, Victoria Підгорна, Yaroslav Jurchyshin, and Konstankevich, MPs of the Ukrainian Parliament, Michael Mayer-Resend, Executive Director of Democracy Reporting International, and our colleagues from Civil Society, Oksana Romaniuk, Executive Director of the Institute for Mass Information, and Igor Skladai from the Center for Democracy and Rule of Law, Deputy Director and leading media expert. I am Andrei Kulakov, Program Director of Internews Ukraine. Unfortunately, I have to wrap up and say goodbye to you now. We have discussed many things that we will be faced with in the future one way or another. We spoke about the upcoming elections and their system. We said that we are thinking about procedures, how to organize this, that it is impossible to go back anymore, to roll back on democracy, that we will be making progress one way or another. We spoke about certain digital solutions and digital threats, particularly in the media sector. We also discussed that public institutions work. Particularly, we spoke about the parliament. It is doing its job, but there is always space for improvement. And we discussed that we need to improve the legislative process, and we can improve the development of policies as well. And another point we discussed is that the media legislation is highly required. It will be able to close certain gaps, but there is a lot of work upcoming, especially when it comes to regulating social networks or exercising certain control or security control over them. And here we need to work with our partners and respond to the challenges of this time. We need to look at the EU directives and regulations. We need to look how much we can adapt to them and how much their reality corresponds to ours, and we need to do all of this to achieve our goal, which is joining the European Union and which is to win this war. So I urge you to help with this and to think about those thanks to whom we can speak about all of this today. Let's think about our defenders, the armed forces of Ukraine. I urge you to help them in every possible way. I wish a peaceful sky above and not so peaceful sky above our attackers. We have been with you, the program Run Next Generation, Internews Ukraine, Center of Policy and Legal Reform, the Reanimation Package of Reforms, and Democracy Reporting International. But stay with us because I already see a very interesting guest. Please stay with us. It will be interesting. Thank you.
we continue today's event. We're very grateful that our third individual panel is with the first deputy head of the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine, the parliament that for over half a year is working during the war. And of course, for him, like for very few people, the challenges, the risks and threats for democracy during the war are very familiar, in particular the threats to the parliament, because its role is evidently the key role in ensuring democratic development of Ukraine during the war. And with your permission, I would like to use this opportunity to be talking to you during the war, one-on-one, offline, on the issues that the civil society is worried about. First, everybody noted that the parliament is fulfilling its constitutional functions even during the war, and for parliament it's very difficult, more difficult than for such institutions, one-person institutions and the president. And all the active civil society of Ukraine, Ukrainian people understand this, but now there is a question: where is this line of ensuring safety and security of the functioning of the parliament and the openness and transparency of Ukrainian parliament for Ukrainian society? Did we find it correctly? Because more and more often the institutions of civil society are saying that maybe this is, let's say, a threat when there is no Rada TV channel. Maybe it is a threat where we can't see the recordings, of course not live recordings, but after a day, after 2 or 3 days, to see what the parliamentarians were saying in the parliament. I even didn't see it, but the experts said that for some reason the results of voting of the previous convocation disappeared. Sometimes it is interesting to see how a certain deputy voted during the previous convocation now, given the full-scale war going on, to compare with his voting now. And a certain question that I would like to ask as an expert on constitutional law is the difficulty of reforming during the war. In particular, I know that the work on parliamentary reform started, regardless of us having the war now. Please outline this question for us, because there are fewer opportunities to speak because we don't see the plenary sessions. Thank you for your questions, Yulia. Good evening to everyone who sees us, who listens to us now. Indeed, the opportunities to talk are diminished, decreased because of the situation that we're in for half a year already. And you know, talking about our parliamentary business, it will always be related with the context of security. You know, it is the war now. Of course, on the one hand, many events happened in this half a year, and now we can talk about a certain level of security in Kyiv, which is higher than in the beginning of the invasion of the Russian Federation on February 24th. But today, the events took place that definitely will continue to change this context. And I'm talking about those events that our enemy announced, mobilization and so on. Currently, there is a certain balance between security of the body that consists of 418 people as of today, one parliamentarian, Chancev wanted to leave, and we agreed, we allowed him to do. I would like to say that on several cases that I took part personally in as a target of advocacy, so to say, and where I observed as well, I see that the civil society knows very well what's going on in the parliament. Maybe people know less about it through live broadcasting, but specialized NGOs. They know the agenda very well. They contact with the committees. They know what's happening, which amendments are being discussed, and they also have the opportunity to influence, because in the past several months there were different directions. We had a tobacco story with hookahs, and there was a story with self-governance, with their attitudes on the law, on self-governing authorities. And there was the story with the business associations. Yaroslav Zhelezniak described it beautifully in his Telegram channel now. And these mechanisms, they found some new form of work, probably the one that wasn't present before, but it is related to the circumstances where the parliament works in now. The broadcast is present. We are on a YouTube channel 2-3 hours after it is broadcast on the YouTube channel. It is made in a way as a Rada TV channel broadcast would have been made. Many cameras, there are all the amendments, there are all the speeches, everything is present there. And we have quite many views. We know that people found this, who need this, they find this. We removed the personal data from the website. We did it to ensure the MP's safety, but the main information is still present here. On the previous years, I think there are some technical moments because, as you said, we have parliamentary reform going on, and a lot is happening on the external communications there. So maybe with the website, there is some technical work being done. Something is being regrouped because demanding users now know that we basically have the old website and the new website. We have the main information on the new design, but the full Parliament website that's been on for the 15 years, it is very difficult to move all of it to the new platform. So it's one of the challenges that we are facing. On the parliamentary reform, we have a very utilitarian approach to this. We're using the pause in reforms that is related to the martial law and to it being impossible to change the constitution. It is actually written in the constitution. The law, the martial law is not. It's quite limiting on the changes to the other legislation and on the changing of the authorities. And we decided to use this moment to work on the suggestions that we've been discussing for a long time. We launched a working group starting in autumn on Parliament, on the agenda. I'm the head of the group, and the representatives of all the factions and groups are there, both the authorities and the opposition. We started from the new season. It was sometime in June or July. We developed subgroups on directions, and the subgroups are now working on the agenda for further reform. The depth will depend on the direction, because, for instance, we have a group that works on the new way of working of the parliament, and these will be the changes that we can introduce after the martial law ends. With the subgroup that does the constitutional reform on cooperation of different branches and bodies, of course, it needs to be submitted to the Constitutional Commission. There's a part of the Commission on the law reform. Maybe it will have some different status later, and it needs to be discussed there. And at the same time, we have quite a good story with the law on opposition, the so-called law on opposition. It's been demanded and waited for a long time, and Yaroslav Yurchishin, who was present here, is responsible for this. His concept is very correct. To avoid politicizing the process, we need to draft a good quality law that could be adopted in the next parliament. It's like a transit book that our parliament can give to the next parliament. We can give them the law on opposition, for instance. So at the same time, many processes are taking place related to Euro integration. It's also a part of a parliamentary reform, because these are the changes in how the parliament works. We have adopted a corresponding document. It is related to Ukraine becoming a candidate to EU member, and with introducing the flag of the EU into the session hall and introducing EU ideas. We created subcommittees on Euro integration and harmonization of legislation in all the committees. We are now working on this, and the role of Euro integration committee also increased, and also the external experts, you in particular, have been mentioning for a while. The role of the government in the legislative process also increased, even statistically. Definitely, we have more government initiatives that have been adopted, and on Euro integration laws, even more of this will be happening, because we know that the expertise and the capacity and many opportunities, let's say capacities, they are in the government, they're concentrated there. We have been reforming the governance since 2016. We have a directorate. It is a coincidence, but it's a good story that the ministries that created the directorates, that almost all of them are created. For instance, the Ministry of Ecology, there we need many laws to be created. So that's what the story is. It will keep us moving forward. Now we are waiting on how we end the track on candidacy, and we will start the negotiation on membership, and we will have many, many tasks from the European Commission on harmonization of legislation, and we are preparing the Parliament for this institutionally as well, because again, after a year, this convocation, 9th convocation, will end, and we know that before the 10th convocation we need to prepare a serious platform, some serious background for their work. Thank you. We are really happy that the directorate start working, and you feel the role of your government, the government that you formed. And here I would like to probably continue the topic of the constitutional reform. You said that within the working groups on the parliamentary reform, the issue is rising of constitutional reform and of its necessity. And we heard that you were saying that, of course, this will take place after the war. But how do you see this process? Do you feel this process is necessary? Do you think that Ukrainian society wants this? I can speak from experience here because I took part in the discussion and the attempts to introduce changes into the constitution on decentralization, and more than one day of my life was spent doing that together with the colleagues. And I'd like to say that the changes into the constitution in the Ukrainian society, in our thinking, is something serious. We need to have serious reason for that. And as we saw with decentralization, the society will not always be ready to constitutional change before it lives through it, before it feels it at the level of legislative changes. Decentralization that we started talking about in 2005, we started doing some projects at the end of 2010s, before the Revolution of Dignity. And then all of it stalled. And after the Revolution of Dignity, in Yatsenyuk's government, in Groisman government, it relaunched. We lived with it for some time. It was very gradual, percent after percent, 10 communities every election, 100 communities every election. In 2019, we continued with it, and we completed it in 2020, the reform itself, the administrative and territorial reform, and reform of duties. And we have 460 independent communities. They have corresponding budget, and we still see some remaining discussion in the society. It leads to discussion in the session hall as well. To have 300 votes, it will be difficult, because our founding fathers, so to say, the authors of the Constitution, they're very correctly designed 2/3 of the parliament. In the democratic country that Ukraine is a democratic country, we will always have the authorities and the opposition. There will be opposition anyway. Opposition is divided, but it works strongly in every direction. If they come together, it's not always easy for us. So 300 votes, it's always a challenge. So these changes, they really need to correspond very serious demands of the society in order to be passed. So they need to be detailed in terms of constitutional law, because the explanations that we get from the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, it is as big as 3 constitutions, right? Or they need to be very clear, very spot on. This is the thing. So how these changes will happen, what these changes will be, we will discuss at the end. Of course, we would like to finish at least with decentralization, to bring it up to constitutional changes. We looked under every possible circumstances that this model works. It works during the war, it works during peacetime, it works with great construction project, it works during election. Let us decentralize. Of course, it is impossible to introduce changes into the constitution during the martial law, and I'm not convinced that this parliament gives 300 votes for this, and we have only 3 sessions remaining, so I'm not convinced that procedurally we will have time to do this. Next session, then there is the autumn session, and half of it will not be ours, so we don't know, but we will definitely have consensus on some things, but unfortunately they are in chapter 1. This is something like, we had a long discussion about the symbol, the state symbol, the big symbol, and the version needs to be discussed, I think, to adopt something. But it's not even chapter 1, it's chapter 2, it can be adopted. But I know that the colleagues also have initiatives on the preamble. It can be changed. Some things are simple. Some things can be added about our Euro integration, decentralization, and so on. Some deep things, but we will see. I think that it is the question that will find an answer to itself, and the leaders of this political process will also reveal themselves, and all of the pool of constitutionalists, we have many, they're very varied, all of them are very powerful. We have our school and Kharkiv school and Professor Zaitsev that heads our subgroup, all with the participation of the civil society. We will be discussing all of this in calmer circumstances, of course. Thank you, Alexander. Maybe before we finish, we hope that no other country has such challenges to democracy and doesn't work like this during the war. But from the inside, as Vice Speaker, in your opinion, what are the 3 biggest challenges that the Parliament could overcome right now to work as a Parliament, as a democratic institution? And what 3 challenges for the Parliament do you see before the end of the war? We all believe in our victory at the front. What 3 challenges would you identify? What would you need to work on?
We have handled the security factor quite well. I think all members of the parliament are okay in terms of security. I think they're doing fine. We have handled the change of the framework of our functioning, the lack of a specific plan, especially during the first weeks of the full-scale invasion. We had this very volatile schedule and it was very difficult to get together, but our logisticians are helping our MPs, and MPs have been very responsible about this as well. And now that we are doing this constant plenary session, which is ongoing. Our planning is working better because we understand 3-4 meetings in advance what we are going to consider. We have this sort of basic agenda. There are committee discussions, working group discussions, so we have all parliament tools that are functioning despite this significant change to the schedule. And of course, there is this challenge connected with the quality of decisions made. Naturally, we have quite a lot of proposals that have been filed by the president during martial law, which had to be improved, and a lot of amendments that we made have already been adopted. A lot of them related to the budget, which makes complete sense during the war. And there is constant work on the quality. It is already working, and we already have this level of functioning that we are not trying to adopt laws that are incomplete, that still need improvement. We keep working. We work within the parliament, with the office of the president, with the government, in order to achieve the maximum level of a draft law and implement it. As for further challenges, of course, the biggest challenge that we see is European integration. It is our challenge as a country. It is our challenge as a parliament, at least to finalize our story with the association agreement. This is definitely our homework, the homework of this parliament, I think. It includes over 40 draft laws. Some of them are a bit controversial. Of course, we also need to complete the story with candidacy. We just need to adopt 2 or 3 draft laws to complete this. But the law on the national communities can also require some discussion with international partners and so on, but we are working on this. We also need to complete our story with the reform of the Constitutional Court. So these are things that we have already started. Of course, as one of the leaders in the parliament, I would like to make sure that the laws that we are working on, that these draft laws that we have been working on since the very first sessions, that should be completed. But a lot of things depend on the parliament overall. But the main task of the parliament of a country at war is to maintain the balance in the budget policy. Today we listened to a very quality budget presented by the government, quality in my opinion, and I hope that we will be able to maintain this and that we will understand we shouldn't make a lot of amendments to the budget. We need to focus on the mandatory expenditures such as defense and security, considering that the fight goes on and we need to maintain our defense capacity every day. And at the same time, we also need to maintain social standards. Any parliament, and especially a parliament with half the MPs selected on the district basis, will go through certain things that are connected with helping people who live in territories with active hostilities and the occupied territories and occupied territories. This is not a one-day thing. We will always have to be making amendments to the budget and to other laws, and we need to listen to our colleagues from European parliaments, the European Parliament, that we need to launch the process of creating a budget office. It is a well-known tool across the world. We also need to have it in Ukraine, but this is the next step. It also pertains to the reform of the accounting chamber. So we are working on these challenges. We are thankful to civil society for their attention to our work. We will try to become more and more open as much as possible in terms of security, and altogether the business, the government, the third sector, we are going to work on Ukraine's victory. We are thankful to everyone, and glory to Ukraine. Glory to heroes. Thank you for finding the time to communicate with us. This type of communication shows the Parliament's openness to civil society, to international partners. And personally, I want to thank you for the work of the Parliament. It's very important. I want to say that we are going to wrap up today's event. It has been organized by 2 internal organizations in Ukraine, the Reanimation Package of Reforms Coalition and the Center for Policy and Legal Reform think tank, together with international partners, namely Democracy Reporting International. We are thankful that the leadership of this organization has been with us live today. This shows Germany's support to Ukraine in particular, and the Center of Policy and Legal Reform has been working as part of the USAID project, rather New Generation. Thank you very much once again. See you soon, and we are moving towards victory together.